On the surface, Thomas Whitmore had a life many people envied. He lived in a quiet town near Oxford, in a narrow brick house with white-framed windows and a small garden that bloomed every spring. He wore clean coats, spoke calmly, and walked with the steady confidence of a man who seemed to know where he was going. To his neighbors, Thomas was polite, reliable, almost invisible in his perfection. But perfection is often just a mask. At 42 years old, Thomas woke up every morning at exactly 6:10 a.m., not because he needed to, but because his body refused to sleep longer. His eyes would open suddenly, as if summoned by an invisible alarm inside his chest. He would lie still for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Silence had become his closest companion. His wife, Eleanor, had left 3 years earlier. No shouting, no dramatic scene, just 2 suitcases by the door and a sentence that still echoed in his head. "I don't feel seen anymore, Thomas." She didn't accuse him of cheating. She didn't say he was cruel. She just said he was absent, even when he was sitting right next to her. After she left, Thomas learned that loneliness could exist even in a full house, and that silence could be louder than arguments. That morning, like every other, he made himself black tea and toasted bread he barely tasted. He stood by the kitchen window watching a man across the street help his young son into a car. The boy laughed, the father smiled. Thomas felt a sharp pain in his chest, not jealousy, but regret. He had once dreamed of that life. At work, Thomas was respected. He worked as a structural engineer, designing bridges, ironic considering how many bridges in his personal life had collapsed. His colleagues admired his discipline, his precision. They did not know that every calculation he made was a distraction from the memories he tried desperately to bury, especially one memory. At exactly 11:47 a.m., Thomas's phone vibrated. Unknown number. He ignored it. A minute later, it vibrated again. Something about it made his hands tremble. He answered. "Mr. Whitmore?" a male voice asked. "Yes. This is St. Mary's Hospital in London. We're calling about your father." The world seemed to tilt. "My father?" Thomas whispered. "I haven't spoken to him in 15 years. There was a pause. "I'm afraid he asked for you. He's not doing well." Thomas closed his eyes. His father, a man built from cold words and heavy silences, a man Thomas had sworn never to come, and yet somehow he had. "I'll come," Thomas said quietly. When the call ended, he sat down, his heart pounding. For the first time in years, something inside him cracked open. Fear, anger, and a strange hope all tangled together. That night, as he packed a small bag, Thomas looked at himself in the mirror. He saw not a successful engineer. He saw a man who had spent his entire life running from pain and was finally being forced to face it. Outside, rain began to fall, and with it, the past started knocking on his door. The train to London felt longer than it actually was. Thomas sat by the window, watching fields blur into gray lines as rain streaked down the glass. The rhythm of the wheels against the tracks usually calmed him. Today, it only made his thoughts louder. 15 years. That was how long it had been since he last saw his father, Richard Whitmore. Their final conversation replayed in his mind without mercy. "You're weak," his father had said, standing in the doorway of Thomas's childhood bedroom. "You think too much. You feel too much." Thomas had been 27 then, recently married, full of dreams that still had color. "I just want you to say you're proud of me," Thomas had replied. Richard laughed, not cruelly, but dismissively. "Pride is pointless. Do your job. That's enough." That night, Thomas left the house and never returned. Now, as the train slowed into Paddington Station, his chest tightened. He felt like a child again, small, unsure, bracing himself for disappointment. At St. Mary's Hospital, the air smelled of antiseptic and quiet suffering. Nurses moved efficiently, faces trained into professional calm. Thomas followed a young nurse down a narrow hallway. "He's in room 412, she said gently. "He's been asking for you since yesterday." Thomas stopped walking. "Why?" he asked. She hesitated. "Sometimes people want to make peace." Peace. The word felt foreign. Room 412 was dim. Machines hummed softly, and there, lying in the bed, was a man Thomas barely recognized. Richard Whitmore had once been tall, broad-shouldered, immovable like stone. Now his body seemed to sink into the mattress, fragile and pale. His hands trembled slightly. But his eyes, those sharp, judging eyes, were still there. They met Thomas's. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Richard swallowed. "You came," he said. Thomas nodded. "I was called." Honesty had always been his weapon and his shield. Richard looked away, embarrassed or ashamed, Thomas couldn't tell. "You didn't think I would." "Neither did I." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Years of unspoken words pressed against Thomas's chest, begging to be released. Finally, Richard spoke again. "I'm dying." The words landed without drama, without tears. Thomas felt something twist inside him, not grief, but confusion. "I know," he said quietly. Richard turned his head slowly. "I wasn't a good father." Thomas almost laughed. Almost. That's one way to put it. Richard winced, not from pain, but from truth. "I didn't know how. My father was worse. I thought discipline was love." Thomas clenched his jaw. "So did I." Richard looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Thomas exhaled. His hands shook now. "My wife left me," he said. "She said I was emotionally absent, cold, distant." Richard closed his eyes. "I made you like me," he whispered. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Thomas stepped closer to the bed. "I spent my whole life trying not to become you," he said, his voice breaking for the first time. "And I failed." Tears burned his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. Richard opened his eyes again. They were wet. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have told you I loved you." The words Thomas had waited for his entire life arrived far too late, and yet they shattered something inside him. He turned away, pressing his palm against the wall, breathing hard. "I needed that when I was a boy." "I know," Richard replied softly, "and I can't fix it." "No, you can't," Thomas thought, "but maybe I can fix myself." When Thomas left the hospital that evening, London's streets glistened with rain. People hurried past, wrapped in coats and their own private tragedies. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not peace, but the possibility of change. And that frightened him more than loneliness ever had. Thomas had never realized how much he hated his childhood home until he stood at the doorstep again. The house was a dark red brick, its windows covered with dust and grime, the garden overgrown with weeds. It was as if the house itself had been abandoned by time. The memories of his early years, the shouts, the silence, the emptiness, flooded him as soon as his foot touched the cracked stone path leading to the door. His father had been a man who believed in strength above all else. He never showed affection. He didn't believe in tenderness. To Richard Whitmore, emotions were for the weak. The only thing that mattered was the ability to withstand pain, to push forward no matter the cost.
Thomas had tried to understand that for years, but all he felt now was the weight of it, suffocating him. The door creaked open, and Thomas stepped inside. It smelled of old wood and dust, the same smell that clung to his memory, the same dark corners where he'd hidden as a child, hoping to escape the anger that always loomed like a storm over the house. His father's study was at the back. The door stood ajar, and Thomas could see the old, worn chair by the desk. It had been his father's favorite chair, the one he'd sat in while reading the newspaper, never looking up. But Thomas remembered the real reason his father sat there. It was where Richard Whitmore had crushed his spirit. At the age of 11, Thomas had come home with a school report full of high marks, hoping to receive even the smallest bit of praise. He'd walked into the study, report card in hand, and had stood there, waiting for his father to look up. "I did well, Dad," he had said, his voice nervous but hopeful. "I got an A in math and a B in history." Richard Whitmore hadn't looked up from his newspaper. He hadn't even moved. His only response had been a single, dismissive grunt. "Good," he said. "Now do better." That was all. No smile, no recognition of effort, just cold, hard expectation. In that moment, Thomas had learned that nothing he did would ever be enough. No matter how much he tried, how much he succeeded, it would always fall short. That night, Thomas had cried, quietly, in his bed. But his
Eleanor
tears
left
didn't matter.
on a Tuesday.
His father's silence
Not
had been
on a
louder
dramatic
than any
night
words.
filled with shouting
As an
or
adult,
broken plates.
Thomas had tried to
Not
bury that
after a
memory,
betrayal
but it
or a
always
confession.
resurfaced. He had
Just a
married
quiet
Eleanor,
Tuesday
thinking
morning,
that if he could
the
love
kind
her
that
enough,
looks
if he could
ordinary
build a life
until it
that looked
becomes a
perfect on the
scar you
outside,
carry
he might
forever.
finally feel good enough.
Thomas
But
was
Eleanor
standing
had
in
left.
the kitchen,
She
tying
hadn't
his
even
coat,
argued with him.
already
She
late
had
for
simply
work.
gone,
Eleanor
taking with
sat
her
at the
the
table,
hope he had
her
foolishly
hands
clung
wrapped
to.
around a mug of tea
And now
that had
here
gone
he was
cold.
again, back in the
"I'm
house
leaving,"
where it all began.
she said.
The phone call
Thomas
earlier
paused,
that day had
not
dragged
because
him
he was
here.
shocked,
His father,
but because
lying
he
in a
felt
hospital
nothing.
bed, asking for him.
"All right,"
Richard
he
Whitmore,
replied
the
after a
man who had
moment.
never once
"When will
shown
you
a
be
shred
back?"
of affection,
She
now
looked at him
asking
then,
for his son.
really
For the
looked at
first
him,
time, Thomas
and
wasn't
something
sure
in
if he
her
was
eyes
angry,
finally
sad,
broke.
or just numb.
"I
He
won't,"
walked into the
she
study,
said.
his heart
That
pounding
was
in
the
his
moment
chest.
she
The
understood
chair
what
was
he
empty
never
now,
had,
but the
that
weight
the
of the
absence
years
of a
seemed to fill the
reaction
room,
was the
pressing
reaction.
down on him.
She stood
Thomas.
up, walked
He
past
spun
him,
around.
and opened the hallway
Richard was
cupboard.
standing in the
2
doorway,
suitcases
leaning
were already
heavily on a
there,
cane.
packed
His
days
eyes
ago,
were clouded,
planned
his face
quietly.
pale, but there was something
"You didn't
almost
even ask
vulnerable
why,"
in his posture.
she said.
"What are you doing
Thomas
here?"
swallowed.
Thomas
His
asked,
throat
his
felt
voice
tight,
colder
but
than
the
he
words
intended.
wouldn't come.
Richard
They
didn't
never
answer
did.
right away. He just
"I've
stood
been
there
alone for
looking at his
years,"
son,
Eleanor
as if
continued.
searching for something
"You
in
sit
him.
next to me,
Maybe
sleep
he was
next to
looking
me,
for forgiveness.
but you're never here.
Maybe he was looking
I
for
talk,
something he had
you
never
listen,
given before.
but you don't hear."
"I'm sorry,"
He
Richard
wanted to
said
tell her that
quietly,
he loved
for
her.
everything.
He wanted to tell her
Thomas's
that
chest
emotions
tightened.
felt
He had
dangerous.
waited years
He
to hear
wanted to
those
tell
words,
her that
but
showing
now that they were
weakness
here,
terrified
they
him.
felt empty.
But what came
hollow.
out was,
"You're sorry?"
"I provide.
Thomas repeated,
I
the
don't hurt
bitterness
you.
rising in his
Isn't
throat.
that enough?"
"You never said it before."
Eleanor
"Why
smiled
now?"
sadly.
Richard's face
"That's
crumpled,
exactly what
and for
your
the
father
first time
taught
in
you,
his life,
isn't
Thomas
it?"
saw the man in
She
front of
left
him not
before
as
he
a
could
father,
answer.
but as a broken
Now,
person,
years
someone
later,
who had never
Thomas
known
stood
how to
alone
love,
in his
and
living
now,
room,
in his final
surrounded by
days, was
furniture
finally
chosen together.
realizing what he had lost.
Silence,
"I
thick
don't know
as
how to
dust.
say it,"
His
Richard
phone
whispered.
buzzed in
"I
his
was
hand.
wrong about everything.
St. Mary's
about you,
Hospital.
about love.
His father
I thought I
was
could
dead.
teach you strength by making you
The
hard,
funeral was
but
small.
I didn't realize
No
I was
tears,
breaking
no
you."
speeches that
Thomas's
mattered.
hands
A few
clenched into
stiff
fists.
shakes,
He wanted
empty
to scream,
condolences.
to shout,
Richard
to release
Whitmore
the
was
years
lowered
of
into the
anger that
ground
had built
like
up
a man
inside
who had
him.
never
But he
truly
couldn't.
lived.
All he could do was
Thomas
stand there
felt
and
nothing,
listen to a man
and
who had
that
never been there
terrified
for
him.
him, finally
Days
admitting his
passed,
mistakes
then
when it was
weeks.
too late.
Thomas stopped
"I
cooking,
needed you,"
stopped
Thomas
answering
said,
calls.
his voice
He
barely
drank
audible.
at night,
"I
not
needed
to
you
forget,
to be there,
but to feel
see
something,
me, to love
anything.
me." Richard's
One
eyes
evening,
filled
sitting
with
on the
tears,
floor with
but
his
he
back
couldn't
against
offer
the sofa,
Thomas what he
he
needed.
realized
Not
the truth
now,
he had been
not
avoiding
ever.
all his life.
"You don't need me
He
now,"
had become
Richard
his
said,
father,
his voice trembling.
not because he
"You've
wanted
become
to,
someone I
but
can't
because
recognize,
pain, when ignored,
someone I never
doesn't
meant you to be."
disappear. It
Thomas turned
transforms.
away, his heart breaking
Thomas
in a
had
way
built
he
bridges
hadn't
for a
expected.
living, yet
His
never
father's
learned
words,
how to
meant
build
to
one
be an
back to
apology,
himself.
felt like a final
He
judgment.
opened a drawer
He had
and
become
found
a
an old
stranger,
photograph,
and now
him
his
and
father was
Eleanor,
condemning
younger,
him for
smiling,
it.
a
I should have
version
been
of
a better
himself
father,
that still
Richard
believed
said, his
connection
voice
was
growing
possible.
faint. But it's
He
too late
stared
for
at
that.
it for a long time.
Thomas took a deep
Then he
breath
put
and
it
walked
back.
toward the door.
Some
But
things,
before he
once
left,
lost,
he
do
turned
not
one
return.
last time. I learned
Months
how to
later,
be like
Thomas
you,
still woke
and
up
now
at
I
6:10
have to
a.m.,
live with that.
still drank
He
black
stepped out of
tea,
the house,
still
the door
lived a life
closing
that looked
behind him with
fine
a
from the
finality
outside.
that echoed in
But
his
inside,
chest.
there was
The
a
rain
hollow
had stopped,
space where
but the
love
weight of
should have been.
everything, the silence,
No
the
redemption
regrets,
arc,
the
no
years of
sudden
longing,
healing,
pressed
just
down on him as he
awareness,
walked away.
arriving
There
too
would be
late
no
to save
redemption,
anything.
no peace,
And that was the
just the
real
quiet
punishment.
ache of a life
Because
lived
the
in the shadow
cruelest
of a
truth of
man
all
who
is
never
this:
knew how to love.
not everyone who realizes their mistakes gets a second chance. Some people only get clarity and a lifetime to live with it. Thomas Whitmore understood now, and he would carry that understanding quietly, the way he had carried everything else. In silence.